dear colleagues, dear friends, top of the morning to you, good health to you. Today we are gathered here at this hall, and first of all let me thank Mr. Pavlo Krivonos, let me thank Madam Inna Homenska and all the colleagues for enabling us to use their wonderful technical capabilities in order to have another meeting on the crucial topic which is I think which is exciting the whole world today, which is disturbing for the whole world. So once again, thank you, Mr. Pavlo Krivonos, for helping us. Your assistance is of crucial importance in this topic, and I hope that these public discussions that we are having combine into this historic chronology. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Krivonos, I was looking in the other direction. Indeed, once again, these are vital topics for us that they can serve as a source of knowledge for many generations of our historians. Today, dear colleagues, we are gathered here in order to discuss the theme which we have dubbed ruscism. What is it? Generally speaking, this designation is not particularly new. It is considered to have been used in the context of Russian politics by our colleague, political strategist, analyst and author of many books, Mr. Ostap Krivnik. He used this term somewhere around 2008 when Russia attacked Georgia, but this term was sounded in public discourse but did not acquire widespread usage. The second stage came in 2014 when Russia started its aggression against Ukraine, but that again, it was still quite sporadic. It was used and forgotten and vice versa, which means that it did not acquire the meaning it has today. But the upsurge in its usage took place in February 2022 when the full-blown Russian invasion against Ukraine started. Today it is being used by almost everyone. It is used by President Zelensky, it is used by Mr. Danilov, Secretary of the National Security Defense Council, it is used in the documents of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, it is used by Ukrainian spin doctors, philosophers, analysts and so on. That is the normalcy today. Furthermore, there are notions like Russianologia, which means basically the science about Russism. People start analyzing what Russism is. According to my estimates, nearly 30 or 40 publications have been brought out analyzing what this phenomenon basically is. Authors are considering whether Russism is just a continuation of Italian fascism, or perhaps it is a continuation of Nazism, perhaps it is a quasi-ideology, or perhaps it is something inherently Russian in terms of this hatred towards anything human. Dear colleagues, excuse me, I haven't yet presented participants, so put otherwise, there is a multitude of questions to be answered. We need to answer the question how to characterize this phenomenon. We need to juxtapose it with other phenomena, similar phenomena, how we counter it. We need to consider how to punish those who are the proponents of this ideology. In this regard, I like my friends from among lawyers of international law, because these people adhere to clarity. Any international instrument starts from the words which contain the definition of terms. So until we understand what we are discussing, until we understand the designation, we are going to have endless discussions on what this topic actually implies. There's a huge number of definition of fascism, but actually there are 14 basic features that define fascism, and they are used now as a starting point of any discussion about fascism. In 1974, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution called the Definition of Aggression, if I'm not mistaken, and it gave the exact definition and features of the aggression, and this document today serves as the basis in order to condemn and blame Russia for committing the crime of aggression. These things are of vital importance, and I would really like us to work in lockstep in order to approach closer to understanding what this phenomenon is. Right before our discussion, I told my colleagues that I recently listened to an interview of two Russian liberals, one of whom is Khodorkovsky and the other is Ostokhov, who are very prominent among Russian liberal circles, and they were interrogated by a journalist whose name is Mikhailo Kozyrev. He said, dear friends, what is particularly disquieting for me in terms of discussing racism is that the Italian fascism is not tied to Italy, just fascism by itself. When discussing Nazism, we do not tie it to Germany, but when we discuss ruscism, it implies direct analogy to Russia. Here's this peculiar notion. It's a very sticky term, which means that it sticks very easily to the one who is the proponent of it. And I think that for many generations to come, many school children around the world will be forced to read it in their manuals, and they will be forced to try to find some justification. They will be forced to find a way out in order to explain what happened. And there is something that evokes this particular fear around this topic. When analysts abroad started discussing this phenomenon, they also started giving their own designations, and I'm sure that you have come across these their understandings, but perhaps for our colleagues that hear it for the first time, there is a belief of famous historian Timothy Snyder, who has recently published a series of articles in the New York Times magazine, and he writes, let me cite him, fascists who called other people fascists is the fascism which is carried to its illogical extreme as a cult of denying development. This is the final point when inciting hatred distorts reality. That is the apex of insanity over intelligence. Calling someone else fascist when you are fascist itself is the main Putin's practice. I would call it schizo-fascism. There is other designations as well. Ukrainians call it ruscism. What infers from here is that ruscism is schizo-fascism. We can take it as a concept, as a certain definition, but formulations similar to this one are various and sundry. It seems to me that it's important to collect the beliefs, the thoughts of our historians, philosophers, publicists, politicians, which could be helpful for us in order to work out a definition of ruscism in its modern form. And it is with this in mind we have invited, I believe, very special guests, because indeed I can say that we have the luminaries of philosophical thought here in this hall today. I'm glad to give you Madam Larissa Yakubova, who is Doctor of History, corresponding member of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, who has authored numerous scientific works on Russia, particularly the book Russian World in Ukraine on the Edge of the Abyss. It is with great pleasure that I present Mr. Viktor Ohryzko, Doctor of Philosophy, full professor, corresponding member of the National Academy of Pedagogical Sciences of Ukraine, rector of Ohryzko Kyiv University, and head of the scientific project called Punish Ruscism. It is with pleasure that I present Mr. Serhiy Datsyuk, a modern Ukrainian philosopher, well-known Ukrainian philosopher, publicist, and author of numerous scientific writings, including his research on what Russia and Russism are. Let me also present Mr. Ivan Zayets, People's Deputy of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine of 5 convocations, Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources of Ukraine in 2000-2001, a famous public and political figure. And let me also give you Mr. Yuri Fedorov, my heartfelt thanks for his attendance. He is our longtime friend and colleague, Russian analyst and publicist, who until 2006 worked in Moscow as a leading employee of the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, who also served as full professor at Moscow State University of International Relations, who has also authored many scientific writings, particularly a book called Russian Between Fascism and Disintegration. So, as you can see, we have colleagues here who can provide an in-depth account of the topics that we are going to discuss. So without further ado, let me remind you that we have a time limit of 15 minutes for each speaker, which means that 1 minute before this time limit ends, I will gently remind you of it. As far as we have simultaneous interpretation into English, I ask all of our colleagues not to speak too fast in order to enable a adequate translation into English, because our colleagues from foreign embassies and analytical centers are listening to us, and we also plan to finish our today's work at 13:15 p.m. It is with great pleasure that I give the floor to Madam Larissa Yakubova, who is one wonderful representation of the fair sex in our today's gathering. Dear listeners, guest from the hall is speaking without microphone, so translation is temporarily impossible. Let me replenish the collection of historical endeavors that you have mentioned. There was a symbolic gathering devoted to the topic Ukraine and NATO relations. So in this regard, it is important to discuss the current Russian developments. One of my colleagues wrote a book entitled 10 Days Before the War, and in the context of the difficult period that we have had, this colleague has recently published this book. Mr. Andrei Ivanovich, thank you for this important remark. That is going to be part of today's discussion. I hope that we're going to spend an hour discussing topics that are connected to finding answers to the questions that I have mentioned. We are living in a democratic country, after all. So now, Madam Larissa, please proceed. You have 15 minutes, and we are going to listen to you very attentively and take note of everything you're going to say. Okay, thank you. Greetings to all of you. Thank you tremendously for the opportunity to speak, although frankly speaking, I wouldn't do that at the moment, because being in the midst of this process as a historian who is engaged in studying the Russian world over recent years, I understand when you're at the ground zero of the explosion, it is very difficult to comprehend what is going on under this pressure. Perhaps it is not exactly the thing we need to do in these circumstances, but I'm forced to do it, compelled, given that this is the thing I do for a living. I can say that this is a colossal Augean methodological problem, and we have felt it. All of us have felt. We have foreseen the resonance this topic has caused. We can see that people are basically in shifting sense when discussing this topic, because it's very difficult to find some logical basis in discussing this almost slang term, the sticky term of ruscism. It perhaps does not even going to find its root in scientific literature, but this is something that has been experienced by people. This is what has been shown in people's suffering, and that is the reason why it is going to stay there in historical literature. Not a single historian has so far given a particular designation of this term, so according to my preliminary considerations, remarks, let me say what happened. On 24th of February 2022, we saw something similar to a coming out of Russian fascism. Before that, it tried to preserve its face and to show its civilized version to the world. No one really came to the microphone to say that I'm a fascist. I mean the rulers of Russia. Although on a couple of occasions Putin cited very gently the works of Ilyin, who is the philosopher who gave rise to the so-called white fascism, which basically underpins the understanding of the world as seen by Putin and also collective Putin, I mean of the entire Russia. So on the 24th of February we saw the coming out of the Russian authorities when they quit pretending to be democratic state, when they quit pretending to be liberal democracy. They used to have many other similar terms to describe what was going on in Russia. This new language was called upon to cover this methodological inaccuracy. used to believe that Russia is similar to other sovereign countries that exist in the European Euro-Atlantic world, and that was a starting point to consider what this Russian system actually is. The coming out has taken place, and although we do not actually have a layer of normative documents to underpin our discussions, there are publications by Alexander Dugin, there are presentations by Sergeytsev and other philosophers, but these are unofficial documents, and nowhere in state instruments is there a designation that this ideology of racism is the basis. There is no indication that they use it as the rationale for destroying and annihilating Ukrainians. But practice proves otherwise. Practice shows that by displaying this schizofascism, as Timothy Snyder says, without crossing all the I's and crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, this is different from Nazism, where Hitler used it as the political rationale for his program, and he made no secret of the fact that he was a Nazi. But these people actually living in the world where they lack the living force in order to say exactly who they are. But that said, their actions actually show their true essence. Talking about what is this exactly, racism, Nazism, or something like this, for me it is racism. There is certain inaccuracy about this term. It is not exactly a scientific term. It's just a designation of this ugly phenomenon given by the Ukrainian people, absent any other definitions. We can take it as a starting point, as a point of reference. Fascism, Nazism, and racism. Fascism and Nazism emerged in the 20th century in the scientific literature, and they derive from the methodological basis when they are regarded as authentic phenomenon. When we are discussing fascism, we understand that this is interwar Italy, and this is connected to Italian Duce, Mr. Mussolini, who wrote some works where he put on display his political ideas when he used in his political career. This is the system of relations, societal and state relations, which he built in Italy in the interwar period. This is what fascism is. This is the Italian version of it. Almost simultaneously with it, Nazism emerged. We need to understand that this is solely a German phenomenon in the interwar period that preceded Second World War, which is etymologically is not synonymous but similar to fascism, and is peculiar or only in terms of being more aggressive, more belligerent. It is the political and ideological edifice which was used as a tool for finding a way out of the crisis for Italy. But in Germany, Nazism was not only about changing Germany, transforming Germany to find a way out of the crisis, but it also prescribed a way of changing the entire world. And the main venue for it was destroying other races that were not like German people. In this way, a whole pyramid, a pseudo-intellectual pyramid, was built that allowed to lay the foundation for recognizing other races as not having the right to live. that is the imperialist project, which was aimed at carrying out an absolute cleansing of Russia and Europe, which was mostly concentrated on Ukrainian soil. That is not really going beyond the Ural mountains in order to create this living space, this Lebensraum for the Third Reich. These are two distinct phenomena. There are quite a few other similar ideological constructs which eventually did not leave a prominent mark in history, but what we need to understand is that concerning those 14 pitches of fascism that you mentioned, people who do not turn to original sources, they view it just as symptoms of a particular state of affairs. It's like you take a certain manual or medical studies. We just start considering the symptoms in order to understand what kind of disease we're dealing with. So if we have 12 out of 14 features, perhaps that can be called fascism, but that is not how it works, because we have historical logic, we have the general logic of historical development, and we also have this inner logic and algorithm of how a certain phenomenon unfolds, in terms of fascism, for instance. So when discussing fascism and Nazism and similar things, how do they emerge? They emerged in the anti-war period between two world wars as a side effect, as a repetition of the developments of these world wars. But they also emerged as a consequence of two global processes, which are liberalization and democratization in the world, in the Western European world, as a process of developing what they are calling now Western European nationhood. I mean the nation states dominated by the belief of general welfare, and not just based on the belief of a state that existed before. Which means that it is premised on democratic development as it is understood now, and not as it was understood in ancient Greece. On the other hand, what is implied here is also some liberalization, which is the legal premise on which this democratization is based. Which basically means that fascism and Nazism are just side effects of this democratization, but basically we need to understand that they did not emerge in all the countries because certain prerequisites are needed for it to emerge. They are more of side effects of a different process, the process of the decline of the colonial world. Most frequently they become a political manifestation in countries which have a colonial history that predated the emergence of Nazism and fascism. For instance, it emerged in Spain, which had its colonial empire, which means that the country needs to have this colonial background in order for these beliefs of supremacy to emerge. So these processes, liberalization and democratization on the one hand, and the decline of colonial empires on the other hand, serve as the basis of this side effect. For us today, what is most important is understanding that this process is not an accident. The main thing which people fail to grasp is that now we considering the reality of what is going on in Russia, the people mostly believe it to be an accident. It is also no accident what we are seeing now with North Korea and in China. There is potential in these countries to form similar to tremendous challenges for the world, similar to Nazism. Moving on, fascism is racism, because fascism is the form of totalitarianism. But this is the totalitarianism which is carried to the extreme, in the sense that it is not what is mostly believed to be supremacy of a state or of a people, atomization of population. That is not true. Totalitarianism, seen as fascism, means that a state is being combined into a single indispensable whole with its people. This is important for understanding why Russian people are supporting the Russian regime. The reason is that the regime and the people become a single whole. They become a single whole with their ruler, their leader, their ducha. They start to associate themselves with the ruler, and it goes into a stage of these crazed ideas, which makes the institutional structure of the state to crumble. This is no longer a state in the institutional understanding. This is an aberrant state. This is a quasi-state organism which becomes a single indispensable whole with its people, which go on to live in the state of this delusional understanding of reality. And then from this delusional state, detached from reality, they proceed to this aggressive stage of existence. This grows into the cult of destructive hatred and barbarism, and in Dugin's words, as he says, excuse me, Miss Larissa, I'll ask you to make a pause here. Colleagues, I would kindly ask you to put away discussions for a different time, because that is distracting our speakers. Madam Larissa, you mentioned a very important point, which is also interesting, in terms of that the fascism is a certain side effect of historical development, so to say, but you also dwelled upon liberalism. That is, there was liberal venue of development which metastasized into fascism and Nazism. But later, when external and internal forces were able to overcome this disease, the society retained the liberal logic of development. And is it also a characteristic of racism? That is the question. Can we find something in racism that can be combined with liberalism? I think not. But once again, this is the topic to be discussed. Taking our topic further, I'd like to give the floor to distinguished Mr. Victor Daniluk, who, apart from his scientific endeavors, has also become an initiator of a very important project that is very forward-looking. I would put it like this. The project, which is generally speaking supposed to give new momentum, supposed to give an incentive to considering Ukrainian and Russian history, and understanding what we need to do to overcome this Russian challenge. I'm not in any way limiting your your remarks, but I would like just to kindly ask you to elaborate on this aspect as well a bit. Thank you, dear Mr. Ohryzko. Perhaps I take as a starting point the thought expressed by Madame Larissa on racism. I think that we need to distinguish between two things. When the notion of racism emerged and when exactly racism as it is appeared. The notion is rather new, but racism by essence has very ancient roots, and these roots emerged when Rus or Kievan Rus dissolved and the Muscovite Tsardom or kingdom emerged on the world map. I saw racism not only on television but in the first days of this invasion near Kiev, and despite the fact that I'm 62 years old, I put on an armored vest and automatic rifle to defend ourselves. So we need to discuss how racism manifested itself near Kiev, and to trace it back to the Muscovite kingdom. So let us consider what Russians did here in Ukraine near Kiev. When you take the Zhytomyr highway, you pass the village of Buzova on your way. There you can see a maternity hospital, and as can be seen clearly from the highway, it is perforated by Russian tanks. If you go on along the highway to the village of Buzova, you can see local school or the remnants of it. It is simply astounding what they did to the school. They were not stationed in the village of Buzova because of the efforts of our territorial defense. They were not allowed to enter the city, the village, but they used their tanks and projectiles to make the school completely unsuitable for all further operation. So now people are collecting funds in order to restore the building of the school. So the essence of racism, as it seems to me, can be explained by these actions. It is aimed at destructing our future and destructing our history. If we go back to the emergence of the Muscovite kingdom, you probably remember the methods Russian kings used. And these methods are very similar to what they did in Soviet times and what they had done throughout the entire Russian history. They annihilated local population, which had democratic traditions of Vicha and other public gatherings. They deported other people and populated these territories they conquered with tribes from the Finno-Ugric part of population, but actually they also destroyed the Finno-Ugric tribes from which they stem. That is, in essence, this animosity towards humans and freedom, and this facility for civility, for this obsequiousness, is what defines racism. Which means that racism emerged a long time ago, but it was not designated, it was not explained. But all these actions, all these deeds are plain to see now, as they were in the past. Apart from that, they also falsified history to the best of their ability. Let's just consider how many libraries have been burned on Ukrainian soil. The latest libraries that were destroyed in Soviet times. I mean, in many universities that you can remember. So what was it? if you say it was not racism, I'm not going to agree, because that was done exactly to eradicate the historical memory and the historical mentions that Ukraine was a civilized state with a very profound history of its own. That is why the notion of racism and the phenomenon of racism have a different history of how they emerged and different history of their existence. To corroborate my statement, I'm also reminded of the belief that has been mentioned here about the rulers and the people and their connection. I can mention quotes by philosopher de Cousin, who issued an important work on Russia in 1839. But the edition I'm going to mention was came out in 1990, together with the article by Sergei Gassin, a philosopher who is well known to you, I guess. He said, "I don't know whether it is inherent in the Russian character to create such rulers, but still I think that there is this double influence, mutual influence, because nowhere except Russia such a regime could emerge. But the Russian people also would not be the same if it existed under different kind of rule." So the racism in this state governing system, which emerged in the Muscovite kingdom, by its nature has not changed along the way. I would describe it as civility to the rulers, which tries to portray itself in a different way than it is in reality. It also implies complete indifference to the fate of the Russian people and to the fate of peoples who live in Russia, which is going to be more correct. There are many national minorities that live in Russia, but what we are seeing now, I fall for it some time ago. This notion of that these national minorities are the ones who mostly contribute to the high level of crimes in Russia, but actually that is done only in order to shirk this responsibility and put the blame on someone else, but not on ethnic Russians. This is this basest manifestation of this state, which puts this blame, deflects this blame on someone else. Not on Russians, but on national minorities who live on Russian soil. This is how the racism displays itself. This is a thing to consider. Let us consider how many Buryats live in Buryatia, the Republic of Buryatia. Just 20%, not more. Some people put forward an idea that Buryats are going to stage a rebellion against Russians, but I don't think that this is likely, because these national minorities are oppressed by Russians. Somewhere in godforsaken place around Russia, there are some ideas to stage this rebellion, to rebel against this oppression, but they are not prominent. So Russians are basically searching for these, they are fantasizing about some non-existent enemies inside Russia. So this is the Muscovite kingdom, and whoever ruled Russia throughout this period, they practiced this tradition of destruction. This is a state which is defined by this belligerence. This is what gives you an explanation of how Russia expanded itself and why it is so spacious. I mean, 22 million kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. It can be explained only by the fact that Russians have always been aggressive. And they are basically using the same rationale in Ukraine. They are just annihilating, eradicating everything that is capable of resisting. They are doing it to subdue it, to subjugate people. So when we are discussing racism as a phenomenon, it is very deeply rooted, and we need to start analyzing it from the very moment when the Muscovite kingdom emerged, because it was then that this essence was laid. We can also discuss when the tradition of falsifying history started. When the monks, Orthodox monks from Byzantium were forced to leave their country, and Moscow was willing to give them shelter, and that was when the myth emerged about the Third Rome. But McClellan did not exactly mention the Third Rome. He said Moscow was the second Kiev, but in reality that was the first Moscow. So let us compare Rome, Constantinople and Moscow. There is a world of difference between them. A world of difference between these states and ideologies. The Russian racist ideology stemmed from this feeling of supremacy. They needed for some reason this head of monarch. They needed to arrogate to themselves the entire history of Rus state, despite the fact that they are only tangentially related to this history. But these roots are deeper. This is what connects them to this history, to the ancient history of Byzantine Empire. That was the supremacy whose foundations were laid, and this supremacy could also be observed in Soviet times. Destroying Ukrainians and Ukrainianhood has always been a priority for them. Among historians here, we still do not have common ground on how many people were killed during the Holodomors. But the most modest estimates say that at least 7 million people were killed. The same also relates to the destruction of Kozakhhood and the Ukrainization of Ukraine. Thousands of schools existed in Ukraine in the Hetmanate period, but for some reason they vanished in the 17th century. And where the Ukrainian thinkers and philosophers go, they were destroyed by the first Russian president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Lomonosov. There was the small book that was published by our colleagues, the influence of Hetmanate on development of Russian culture, when the tremendous evidence is collected on how Ukrainians contributed to the development of Russian culture, the theater, and so on. Peter I tried to be very similar to Europeans, culturally speaking, but in essence he remained the same racist ruler. So there is this continuity among Russian rulers. It can be historically corroborated, and this continuity is based on the racist ideology, whatever its designation may be in Soviet times or in times of modern Russia. Perhaps schizo-fascism sounds more compelling, but I agree with this estimation. Thank you. thank you, dear colleague, for fitting exactly into the time limit of 15 minutes. And now I'm glad to give the floor to Mr. Sergei Datsuk, a renowned philosopher, famous person in Ukraine, who has devoted a tremendous amount of time to analyzing Russia, who has authored many publications on this topic, who has been a frequent participant in our discussions. So please, Mr. Sergei, give us your account. Thank you. Just to be on the safe side, I've taken some of my notes, my publications on ruscism, for those who have not had a chance to read it. But we have this movement of thought here. I would say I've taken note of some questions from my colleagues, and I'll try to give some answers to these questions. So, why ruscism? And not Nazism, for instance, and not imperial fascism, which also seems to be a good option. I'd say that ruscism is predicated on imperialism, which in its animosity towards reality strives to be excluded from the international community. It aspires to be excluded. They exclude themselves from the international community. Therefore, they are called racist, because that is what describes their internal drive. They are not doing anything universal, they are just arrogating it to themselves individually. That is what gives a certain flair of uniqueness to this phenomenon, which also leads to the singular demise, because when a single country excludes itself from the international community and does not have the power to conquer the entire world, it just crumbles. That is my understanding of Russism as the the Russian imperial Nazism. We are talking about not about the dominance based on national grounds, but on the grounds of imperialism, because the Russian nationalism is prohibited in Russia. Russian nationalists suffer even more than Ukrainian nationalists these days. And this is not something that is supposed to make us sympathize with them. But the problem is that when they understand, once they bet on Russian nationalism, it is going to give momentum to other nationalisms inside Russia. That is why I wrote an article where I draw people's attention to the thing that we need not spread Russian discourse, which means that we need to renounce from the usage of such things as denazification and demilitarization. Rather, we need to use the term de-imperialization and de-Russization. That is a matter of principle, because it forms our discourse. Because if we say that we have denazified 10 Russian soldiers, that is not correct. We have de-imperialized them, we have de-Russified them. That is a principal topic. We are not supposed to repeat this Russian discourse. So why fascism, and what is it? We're not supposed to echo Umberto Eco and his 14 features of fascism. This is the realization of the aim to assert imperial dominance. This is the basic feature of racism, and all the others are not that important. It is of no consequence. We have this aim to attain global preponderance by destroying any sort of intelligence in order to be united by simplicity. That is what defined fascism. It means that it renounces tolerance in order to form this subservient and servile obsequiousness. That is how we come across this principally different kind of society, because civil society is non-existent in Russia. We have seen it. We can see that in Russia there exists a principally different kind of society, which is a subservient society. We need to study this society because it is underpinned by completely different things. And ultimately, this society destroys itself from within. They deflect the blame for their crimes on others. They blame themselves. They blame others for their racism. It implies manipulation of international law. Russian imperialism is opportunistic, which means that no one has ever managed to come to an agreement with it. Once Russia sees when a certain agreement does not suit its interest, it immediately violates it. The opportunistic state always violates any kind of agreement, be it bilateral or multilateral. It violates any kind of consensus and customs. This principle, opportunism, is what defines it. And therefore, this opportunism takes advantage of international law in order to stage manipulations. Russia is not using international law in legal terms, it just is using international law as an instrument of dominance. That is exactly where schizophrenia derives from. This is the way how it broadcasts, conveys itself on the outside. If the term fascism does not suit it, it is going to select any other kind of term. This is the opportunism as it has been traditionally used. This is a double ideology. Let me pay attention to this. It is the conscious, well-reflected and strategic, because a man with schizophrenia cannot be responsible for his actions. Schizopascism, seen from this regard, is somewhat simplified, because it implies that these people do not control themselves, rather they are opportunists. This is a matter of principal importance. It also explains why schizofascism is not really the correct term for us to use. Changing this Russian society is going to be an Augean task, which is probably nearly impossible. Some of us perhaps imagine that there's going to be a trial for Putin and his accomplices. We are going to present our accusations and evidence. They're going to present their own arguments. That is not what is going to take place, because Russia does not abide by any agreements. Russia is not going to acknowledge any kind of accusations, which means that we need to choose a different path. Let us see how the international community acted in the aftermath of the Second World War. In the Federal Republic of Germany, they found this basis which could be used. This basis was manifested by Christianity, which served to create the structure of Christian democracies. Can the same be done in the case of Russian fascism? Well, we can draw up a list here. Marxism, for instance. Marxism is dead in Russia. It exists only nominally and symbolically. Liberalism is not acceptable. This is a subject of propaganda in Russia. Orthodox traditions are compromised so much that making a bet on it is impossible. Intellectualism. There are four things that characterize them: degeneration, disorganization, and other similar things. So there is nothing to serve as the basis for changing Russia. Me and my wife have discussed this topic on several occasions, and we came to the conclusion that perhaps we will have to take the path of Orthodox traditions, but non-classical traditions like baptism and others. That is one of the hypotheses to consider, but let me draw your attention to the fact that neither intellectualism nor Orthodox traditions nor any others are not going to work in Russia. Another question is whether Ukraine should do any business with Russia. Well, Ukraine definitely should, even if Russia is not denuclearized, because we do not have any other way. If we are not dealing with Russia, Russia is going to deal with us. So we need to do this conceptual work. Like the West some time ago launched post-colonial studies, we need to launch these post-Russian and post-imperial studies, perhaps post-totalitarian studies, name it as you like. Because in the times that came after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we believe that we can understand it as it is, but not everything can be understood when you find yourself in this logic. So we need to launch these post-Soviet, post-totalitarian and post-imperial studies, which are absolutely indispensable. We need this aspiration to study Russia, because if we are not studying Russia and dealing with Russia, Russia is going to deal with us. That is the basis. If we are going to make Ukraine independent, and we do not understand it completely at the moment, what an independent Ukraine is. When discussing it, we simply mean that we are independent from Russia, but understanding independence as an ontological phenomenon, independence from the West, from China, from Russia, is an Augean task. We have not really considered it for now. And if we take this assertion, this aspiration, this leads us to the belief that we need to put an end to this tradition when Russia deals with us. Instead, we should deal with Russia, and when we do it, we will become an independent entity. We also need to deal with Europe and the West as a whole. We need to reconsider the structures that they are using, because otherwise we are not going to attain independence. The United Nations is not working to our benefit, but it is supposed to work in this manner, and this is the task of a different level. We need to reconsider the United Nations. So ruscism is a challenge for us. It needs to be perceived in terms of practice and theory. And it is only in dealing with this challenge and this issue we can obtain a chance for survival. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting view of what we are discussing today. You know, I heard an opinion that if Russians do not want to be nationalists, you know, in this context, we are now objectively approaching the moment when we hear the thoughts of Mr. Yuri Fedorov, a renowned Russian analyst and publicist, a person who, for many years, has understood the nature of Putin's regime, has left Russia, has observed those processes from the side, and who has seen them in a much more profound way than the people who today in Russia itself attempt to build the projection of the great Russia of the future. Unfortunately, those are indeed mere projections, because in my opinion, there are no real perspectives of liberal development there. However, when it comes to what we have to do going forward, this question will be discussed, but unfortunately we are just scratching the surface. Mr. Yuri, I'm pleased to give the word to you. Please proceed with your 15 minutes. Thank you. Good day, esteemed guests and colleagues. I am grateful to Mr. Ohryzko for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak at this conference. I am also, as you, my Ukrainian language is not, I do not have the greatest command of Ukrainian language, and if needed, I could speak in English or in Russian, if you allow me. You may speak in the language you're comfortable with. Thank you. The question we are discussing, I believe to be very important, both for the future of Russia and the future of the war of Russia against Ukraine, Russian aggression against Ukraine, and in general for the future of Russia, or Europe in general. The question of what ruscism is, to me, perhaps it is hard to give a clear definition for me, because it divides into several aspects, methodological aspects of this issue, purely practical aspects. So it is hard to prove that Russism is a form of fascism endemic to Russia itself. Maybe even a form of orthodox fascism. And we face the question of whether such regime, such system is sustainable, because we know that Russia, fascism regime in Italy and Nazi regime in Germany were founded, were based upon the extensive support of the population of various social middle class, and those regimes fell mainly as a result of military defeat. Hence, if ruscism unfortunately, we are having a slight technical issue. The speaker disappeared from the Zoom conference. Let us wait a while. After all, we are very interested in interested in the opinion of our colleague from the Russian side. However, to be frank, having lived abroad for more than 15 years, giving lectures in Italy and Czechia, I believe he is no longer an official representative of the Russian world. I believe perhaps, unless the situation resolves itself, do not waste any time. We may allow our last speaker for today to speak, but not the last according to the list. Because as we have heard already during the discussion, this is not a mere theory, it also includes very serious practical aspects, practical matters, which we cannot yet answer. We can spend a long time analyzing the notion, the phenomenon, the process, but we also must understand what will be the end of it. In the final part of his speech, Mr. Serhiy Datsyuk spoke of this. What must happen at the end? That Russism must be judged as ideology, its perpetrators be punished, and we must determine what will be the role of Ukrainian state in this. Thus, for now, I must unfortunately interrupt Mr. Fedorov, should he even reappear, and I ask Mr. Ivan Zayats to speak. Firstly, I'm grateful to Mr. Ohryzko for organizing this roundtable, for gathering us here, for the subject is important, but frankly, there has not been enough attention in Ukraine to this topic. And to illustrate this, I might share my experience in various education institutions with different experts in media on the subject of the launching of scientific projects and roundtables and conferences about this topic. Over 3 years, I only managed to initiate the discussion within a sole international conference which took place in the University of Ohryzko in Pereyaslav. I'm also aware of the fact that apparently in the Institute of Law there was a small conference where they discussed legal legal aspects of the word ruscism. So I hope that this roundtable will give impetus to more activity in this direction, this field. I would like to cover several arguments. Firstly, to speak of the relevance of this research, of the ideology of ruscism, to touch the sources of this term, what it is, and to suggest my own ideas regarding the resolution of this roundtable. Firstly, regarding the relevance of the research, I see at least 3 reasons for the relevance. First is the reasons of the war. We must know who we'll be fighting against. It doesn't mean that we only must know what is in the head of Putin or his military leaders. We also must understand the psychology, the conscience, the spirit of the Russian soldier. And if we are not researching racism as ideology and social phenomenon, we will not know what we must do to counteract this evil. Were we learning the history and ideology of Russia, we would be approaching the war. We would have approached the war differently. We would have conducted evacuation. We would not have allowed the heroization of the defenders of Mariupol to happen, as well as many other things. The second reason lies with the interest of researchers. The Western society always demonstrates great interest, attention to the ideology, in particular to the ideologies of totalitarianism. We must have scientific forecast. We are living in a very dynamic world amid the process of acceleration of the time itself. we cannot go through this without science. And thirdly, today already we must consider what will the post-war global system be and what will our place therein be. For if we just continue scratching at the surface of this, of the notion of this absolute evil, we will not be able to solve those issues. We must de-Russicize Russia itself. We must take steps which allow for that to happen. The second issue is the issue of the body of works. There have been a great number of publications abroad and some publications in Ukraine, but we are somehow missing the materials containing various insights and wisdoms. In one particular such source which we need, which is crucial for us right now, is our Ukrainian literature. When we are looking at the issue of racism, first of all, we must reflect on the fact that they are different from us, they are opposite from us, and we have a great body of work, including Shevchenko, the poem Kafkaz, the poem Katarina, where the very first lines urged us not to familiarize with Russians because they are alien people to us. And in the poem Kafkaz, he illustrates the nature of the Muscovite people better than anyone ever could. Lesya Ukrainka, similarly, she portrays the mentality of Muscovites. In our era, the poem Memory of Pavlichko or the poem We Have Never Been Brothers by Anastasia Dmitruk. This is a large body without which science and political science could not research this. The topic of racism is a compound term from two terms, Russia in English and fascism. This is a very simplified view, and according to this view, following this view, we are unable to fill this term with its true essence. This is a term created by Russians. This is a term endemic to them, used for the first time by Russian historian Nikolai Andreev as a reaction, commentary to a series of articles of a military historian, Karim Russia, called Russia, which praised the militarization of Russia at the beginning of the 90s, and he wrote an article called, designated Ruscism itself. And if we delve into this work, we see that the idea of this military expansion, if you will, barbarism, and he put those ideas into this term. And this is one way to understand fascism, with the ideas of unity. Now let's look at the views of racism as totalitarian ideology. There are two main views. One is that racism is a form of Nazism or fascism, and the second is that is only starting to gain attention, gain traction, and I'm pleased that my colleagues here at the Roundtable stressed that this is a separate ideological phenomenon which we must focus on separately. I'm dramatically opposed to looking at racism as Russian fascism or neo-Nazism or schizo-fascism, because those are this is a version of the methods of looking at it as a simplification of fascism, trying to grasp for something we already know. But this method unfortunately does not work in this direction, I believe, because Russism is a term is a phenomenon endemic to Russia. I support the idea of viewing Russism as ideology, once again endemic to Russia, with characteristics which distinguish it from among the other totalitarian ideologies such as Nazism or communism. Using this method, we can achieve understanding and knowledge that will allow us to combat this absolute evil and the causes behind its emergence. And well, the way I understand Russism, the definition I'd give to it is as follows. I believe that Russism as a totalitarian ideology about hatred of people is a synthesis of long-standing horde mentality of their missionary chauvinism and the practice of imperial expansionism and genocide of unsubdued people, and of the barbarian heritage of Marxist-Leninist ideology of Hitler's Nazism and Mussolini's fascist. Racist outlook is emerged from the long-standing Muscovite mentality of the horde, of messiah chauvinism and imperial expansion and extermination of the peoples who want to live separately the way they see fit and who do not to be dissolved within the Muscovite horde. This is the main characteristic which distinguishes this ideology. They look at it like, well, you do not want to dissolve among us, then we will exterminate you, and you will be no longer. This is their main characteristic. And the concepts of hostility, animosity are separate. Today, racism is an manifestation of absolute evil. It was stressed already today. Fascism was less militarized, Nazism more, and racism has taken this aggressiveness to extreme, and we must pay attention to this aspect. Another issue. Today we talk about racism as ideology, which means that on its further political development, ideology turns into political doctrine. And today, political doctrine in Russia is the Russian world. Prior to that, they talked about Slavic ideas, Slavic notions. And today we must coalesce those ideas of political doctrine, ideology, into a set of ideas, mottos, and on the other hand, see the prerequisites creating this ideology and how the ideology itself forms upon it, including the national conscience of the Russians. Hence, when we speak of racism as a separate, unique ideology which must be looked at separately from Nazism, fascism and communism, we must note that a special peculiarity is the carrier of this ideology, the Russian people. It all stems from the Russians. It is difficult to speak of them today as the people in the truest sense of the word, as an ethnic community. The term Russians, or as someone says, Russkие, designates not an ethnic quality, an ethnic designation of this community, but political. Istrov says that the Russians are not yet a people, it's a community in a transitional state as a nation, and this transitional period has been lasting for more than 300 years, going through such stages as Russians, Soviets, and so Russians are not really people. They are going through their formation, and in doing so they are tormenting us. And we must try to understand what ideology is brewing within these people. It's a paradox when we speak of Russians, Russian people, and then see within this Russian ethnic group, the ethnos of Russia, and some other peoples which are non-Russians. This is a paradox which must be solved. And this characteristic determines some other peculiarities, the largest of which is the fact that ruscism directs the authorities and the society towards the destruction of the people who do not want to live as part of it. Now, when it comes to the peculiarities of this ideology, we speak of what GDIP said and leaders of the Chechen liberation movement in general. They outlined a very clear vision of this notion. GDIP said that Russians are building their world upon a very dangerous ideology. He defined racism with the word ruscism in Russian as a special form of ideology of hatred for people based on chauvinism, complete lack of spirituality, and total immorality. He outlines such characteristics of this ideology as inhumane violence, cruelty, destruction as the main principle, as modus operandi, and psychology of slavery, constant political, legal, and ideological terror, practice of scorched earth. You all have heard of the recent statement by the Russian general that on Ukraine there will be either Russian land or scourged desert. Statement regarding the Zaporizhzhia atomic station power plant. And two small remarks. First, when we compare the roots of ruscism and, let's say, fascism or Nazism, I would like to present to you several quotes of Hitler. Hitler said, "I always studied the techniques of my adversaries, Lenin, Trotsky, and others." It says that this entire methodology, those methods were already developed prior. Then he says, "I'm not afraid of learning from Bolsheviks." Hence, the ideology of racism today is defined in this political doctrine of the Russian world. This is the apex of the ideology described by Mr. Ohryzko, which draws upon the history of the imperial stage of the Russian statehood. It is undeniable that the ideology of racism must be prohibited in Ukraine. And on the 12th of April of this year, I suggested to adopt a law on the prohibition of racism, on counteracting the ideology of racism, on the accountability for the propaganda of racism. And there was a draft law, which was unfortunately then declined. And I believe that there has to be such a law, just like we have fascism, anti-Semitism prohibited along with Nazism, communism, but racism for some reason is not yet prohibited. And then Russians themselves say, look, they are fighting against the phenomena which are not prohibited in their own country in the legislation. The next point, we must form the anti-Putin coalition, because without victory in the war, today it is impossible to deal with this absolute evil. The victory may only be achieved when we create a true anti-Putin coalition and win the war. The third point, we must continue the policy of decommunization and decolonization, because once again we are witnessing certain displays of counteracting those processes. The educational processes and the media structure must be reorganized as well. And once again, we must approach this problem from a more practical standpoint, political point of view. We must look at this evil which today prohibits us from living normal lives and threatening our future development. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Zayas, for your very clear, distinct proposals. I believe we will address them going forward. Mr. Fedorov is already with us again, and once again, we have run into some technical issues. I'm hoping that it's not Russian special services which are working against us, and once again we are addressing you and giving you the word. I'm grateful, and I also apologize for the technical disarray and induced by the Russian security services, special services plot. Once again, I'll speak in Russian. I'm not sure if you heard me last time I said that, esteemed audience. The issue which we are discussing is very important because ruscism, I believe, I would like to add to several valuable ideas already expressed in this roundtable. According to me, racism is the ideology and practice of the current Russian regime, but only in the Russian sense of this term. If we look at it in the general sense, then we see that racism, I believe, is the existence, as philosophers would say, of the Russian system in general. The system, including not only political components and institutions, but also the culture, the social system, social architecture, including the relations between the authorities and the society. Hence, if that definition stands true, then racism is the apex of the evolution Russian society has been undergoing, as well as the Russian political system over many centuries. And I believe it was very well pointed out that racism is deeply rooted in the practices of the Muscovite kingdom, in combination with Byzantine traditions and the traditions of the Golden Horde. And in general, today, it is a reincarnation of what we could call a combination of a mix of Byzantine and Golden Horde ways of political conduct. It is not a coincidence that the coat of arms of Russia is the same two-headed eagle used by the Horde, which at the same time looks to the west to Byzantium and to the east to the Asian steppes. Therefore, the matter of racism, of its essence, I believe devolves into two aspects. First of all, what is it? Is racism a special, unique form of fascism, or something which has evolved over time, as I think, from the Italian model of fascism, typical to the Italian period, typical to the Mussolini period of Italian history, which has somehow evolved towards the Nazi ways of totalitarianism, which has acquired completely anti-human characteristics, inhumane characteristics. The second aspect indispensable from the subject of whether racism has been artificially imposed upon the Russian society by the authorities, by the circle which has acquired power together with Vladimir Putin, or or given that Vladimir Putin, together with his surroundings, has been in power for around 20 years, it may speak that this regime is the reflection of the very models endemic to the Russian conscience. Considering what we see today within the Russian Federation. And if that stands true, then we face many political questions of whether the nature, the essence of the regime will change in the event of the replacement of certain political figures of the regime, or in spite of any, once again, potential removal of Putin, which is likely to follow the defeat of Russia in the war against Ukraine, which might be succeeded with the restoration of the Putinism in its most aggressive and strict shape. And then we face another issue: what can be done to prevent such restoration? We know that history shows that restoration restoration of Putin would be restoration of totalitarian regime, totalitarian regime of the Soviet Union, of the Russian Empire, was never sporadic or incidental. And we do not entirely understand the reasons behind it at this stage. However, if we go back to the question of what ruscism is, I believe that we must be looking for the answer to this question in comparing the characteristics typical to fascism regimes and the Nazi regime, and comparing them with the relevant state of the current events in Russia, of what currently transpires in Russia. The first signs, characteristics of ruscism, there are many of them, and they are very diverse. Over 100 definitions have been expressed by many authors who deal with those issues, and I made an attempt to group those definitions in several overall characteristics expressed by the researchers. The first one, and one of the major ones, is the authoritarian regime, the authoritarian power, which is completely endemic to the modern Russia. The second characteristic, not any less important, is the special role of the leader. Whether we speak of Duce, the Führer, the leader is essentially a sacred person, a manifestation of the will and the expectations of the people. Putin is very much nearing such a role of a sacred leader, spiritual leader, and I would like to outline also several practical moments, including the absence in Russia of a real mechanism of replacements of leaders. Yes, they are enshrined in the constitution, the relevant procedures. However, the constitution has absolutely no bearing on the actual political processes in Russia. Russia lacks a mechanism of limiting the authorities of the leader. We witnessed it clearly during the infamous and humiliating for its participants the meeting of the Russian Security Council of the 22nd of February of this year, where the decision to launch the aggression against Ukraine was virtually adopted. And it was clear from that moment that while some members of the higher leadership of Russia may have been harboring disagreement with the decision of Putin, but they were afraid of demonstrating their disagreement. They were afraid of demonstrating even slightest signs of opposition to their leader, their chief. Typical to the fascism is the liquidation of opposition, leading to the absence of opposition, which is once again characteristic of the modern Russia. It simply does not have opposition. There is a number of figures which have oppositional views. However, politically, as political entity, as political reality, organized opposition does not exist in Russia, nor does it exist outside of it. And I imply in this the Russian diaspora, the people who left Russia, who has left Russia over the past several months. There have been attempts, sporadic and chaotic attempts to form organized oppositions, but the perspective of forming real political opposition among the Russian diaspora in Europe and in the world in general, I believe those perspectives are absent. And in the nearest future, it will most likely not appear. Control of the key vectors of economy, key fields of economy, is yet another characteristic of fascism present in modern Russia. Visible with many state enterprises like Rosneft, Gazprom, and so on and so forth, and all the while corporations are being controlled by the people surrounding the leader. A key moment, a key characteristic of both fascist and Nazi regimes is the social foundation. We see positive public opinion right now in Russia, and that there are no effective, tangible oppositional acts in Russia, oppositional activities. In their majority, the Russian population is either indifferent to the events, to the processes in the country, as long as those events do not concern their day-to-day life. And the rest, at the extreme, they support the Putin regime and demonstrate support of the aggression against Ukraine. The polls of public opinion show that over 70–80% of the Russian population stands in support of the aggression against Ukraine. Those estimates are said to be incorrect because the people in reality are afraid of expressing their true stance. But nonetheless, we have no grounds to speak of a serious anti-war movement in Russia, including and the representatives of Russian educated people either choose to ignore the acts of the Russian army in Ukraine, pretend that they do not see it, and the rest are attempting to justify, to explain the aggression. Many researchers have defined the nature of Putin's regime as ideology directed towards drawing upon the past, upon the traditions, and aiming to restore the past in the modern environment. It was typical to the regime of Mussolini, and even to the Nazi regime, which was looking for ideals and models of behavior endemic to what they thought was the culture of original German peoples, even if it had no relation to the actual historical reality. But nonetheless, tradition served as the main motive and driving force of this ideology. The same happens in Russia today, and we see that truly the regress to the past is now one of the factors of the regime's operation, of its policy. Now, Nazism. Nazism is distinguished with three characteristics. First is the physical elimination of groups of people who are considered harmful or hostile, then it's territorial expansion, and the unification of the people within one state, which now in Russia is called the Russian world. The aim of physical destruction combined with territorial expansion and I imply elimination of Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian state. Those people who were not ready to accept forced Russification, and the leading media in Russia speak of this. And the final point goes to the question of what we must do against racism, how we must counteract it. I believe that the answer is as follows. Racism was not imposed upon the Russian political regime, upon Russia. Racism is the reflection of the psychological and moral and political notions existing within the Russian society. And to avoid the repeat of history, we must finalize the collapse of the Russian Empire, if necessary, by doing so on the territory of Russia itself. Thank you, Mr. Fedorov, for a very informative and interesting view. It is important to us because you probably understand Russia better than all of us present, as well as the internal tendencies. And I believe the final point you expressed, how we must combat racism, is especially relevant. It will remain relevant so long as Russia in its current boundaries exists. Dear friends, all of our speakers have finished presenting their informative speeches, their thoughts, and right now we are moving on to the traditional segment of the roundtables, the sharing of thoughts. I would like to ask you to be brief. We do not have that much time left. We have 15 minutes left, and I already see there are those who would like to speak. Sergei Borshevsky is the first, then so please, colleagues, if you can, be as brief as possible, however, be constructive. Firstly, the final remark about the Russian world from the last speech. The Russian world is a notion not at all equivalent to the one existing in Germany during the Nazi regime, because the Russian world does not envision just the Russian people. The German idea meant the ethnic Germans, including in Austria, but here they imply Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, absolutely all the people, even those who live on Brighton Beach. They are all part of the Russian world. Now, the main point of a discussion, according to me, which is very important, is the continuity from the Muscovite Kingdom until today. However, we must also address the current state of Russia and its defining characteristics of today. Nowadays, Russia is unique in that it is ruled by special services. Today, Russia is unique due to the fact that it is constructing yet another international community of rogue states. Today is unique in that it has been until today able to mimic the features of democratic society. They have a president, elections, parliament. However, all of those things are not what they are perceived as. It would be very interesting to see an actual number of a list of representatives in the Russian parliament from various political forces in Russia, and then we would see the critical mass of that lot. Now, when it comes to the essence of our topic, there are two major moments. I already told to Mr. Ohryzko that perhaps we might rename the Center for Russian Studies into the Center for Russist Studies, but this is where we must take caution. Follow the guidelines set forth in the international law. We must look at the existing legal instruments. As of now, they do not have the term ruscism in them. Thus, following the international law, we must facilitate the punishment of the Russian regime in accordance pursuant to those instruments. Finally, and with that, to finally put it in its grave. As a member of our community, of our Center for Russian Studies, we will certainly discuss this matter and figure out how we might modify our work.
Mr. Vasily, just 3 minutes, please. So, when we are discussing that up until today we cannot really come to understanding what is the exact designation of ruscism, I cannot agree with this. This is heart-wrenching to me. Over these 8 years since this open aggression against Ukraine started, I have published 17 publications and books, so this gives rise to a natural question: was it in vain? I have many submissions and letters from people, and there are many results in Google that give you an idea of how many works have been published by me. I have been decorated with orders for merits and many other things, which means that there are certain results to my work. Which means that many people are writing publications, but few people are reading them, actually. Because everyone seems to believe that they have already acquired enough experience to write books, but not read them. So, which means that if a book is actually published, you need to write a book review on it, you need to read it, and when it is not done, that is the sign of trouble. That is a wake-up call. The second point, excuse me, talking about ruscism, I have the magazine Political Management from 2007, excuse me, that was 15 years ago. And the starting article of this magazine is called Corporativism That gives rise to the question: why did the author use the term corporativism and not ruscism? Some time ago, Hegel told, however much you dig into the tree, if it's not an oak, you're not going to see an oak in it, because that is how nature develops. That is the way evolution is working, which means that the living organism must come through all the stages of its development. Talking about the corporativism, which I mentioned as early as 2007, I wrote to make it abundantly clear that the corporatist state is one of the forms of the authoritarian political regime which is characteristic of fascist states. Corporatist ideals were most clearly used in fascist Italy. So, once again, what kind of corporativism are we discussing? This means that corporativism is evolving. It is coming through a number of stages in its development. When owners and banks just bought the country and started ruling it, then the second stage proceeds, which can be described as bureaucratic corporativism, which leads to turning this corporativism into a state structure. The third stage is autocratic or corporativism, ruled by Putin and his close circle. So this gives rise to the question: when does the fascism come onto the stage? I mean, I think that it started in 2014. That was exactly when it acquired the features which are characteristic of fascism. Every one of us has their own understanding. It may differ from what Timothy Snyder said, but when Putin published his article on the unity of the Russian-Ukrainian peoples in July 2021, where he said that we need to finally settle the Ukrainian question, exactly how Hitler intended to resolve the Jewish question. That is when this corporativism in Russia acquired the features of fascism. I mean that we are working in this venue, but not really that many people are paying attention to what we are doing. Excuse me, you have exceeded time limit. Thank you for your remarks. Stanislav Yevgenovich, please, the floor is yours now. I totally agree with my colleague who has just spoken. Excuse me if I misspelled your name. I agree with you totally concerning your opinion on the profound roots of racism, but I would also like to present a few more facts. In the pre-Putin period, when working in the Society of Connections with Ukrainians Abroad, I assisted in the creation of Ukrainian civil organizations in Russia. And I also helped in erecting monuments to Taras Shevchenko in 1992, together with the leader of the Ukrainian community in St. Petersburg. We asked Mayor Sobchak to give an answer to the aspiration, to our aspiration of erecting a monument to Shevchenko in St. Petersburg in 1992. The leader of the Foreign Office at that time was Mr. Putin in the mayor's office, and the monument to Shevchenko was erected in that same 1992. That sculpture actually laid covering in dust for 8 years. And that was exactly because of what Putin wanted to do with it. And it was not until 2000 that that monument was erected in St. Petersburg. As for Norilsk, that was 1993. The mayor of Norilsk told that, well, actually, we came to the Russian city in order to organize a circle of people who despise Russia. And actually, for that reason, I was trying to speak to them in Russian in order to give them an idea of who I was. Despite the contradictory statements and divergent opinions of my colleagues, I represented there as a diplomat, as a representative of the foreign ministry. Everyone is afraid there to speak Ukrainian, despite the fact that actually the area is inhabited by a great many number of Ukrainians. And in order not to exceed the time limit, because we have a great many questions to discuss, I can also mention the meeting with Vyacheslav Nikonov. And Alexander Dugin was also present there, to which Nikonov said, well, at the end of 1999, when Yeltsin made a statement that Putin is going to be his successor, Nikonov was asked to take soundings of who was going to be Yeltsin's successor. He told that it was going to be Mr. Putin. One more thing was my meeting that I had in New York back in the day. I read an article from New York Tribune magazine, from which I can give you a certain quotation. The civilizational development of humankind is inhibited by the claws of the Russian creature. This is the quote that dates back to the 19th century. A famous Russian historian, Taras Humchak, delivered a public lecture entitled Russia, an Identity of the Enemy. And in 2018, his nephew, whose name was Marko, died near Ilovaisk. Once again, I call on all our colleagues to continue writing their publications, because there is a great deal to discuss. We only have time for 3 brief remarks now, and now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Yevgen Vershada, who will be followed by Mr. Oleg Romanchuk, and finally by Ostap Krivnik. And unfortunately, that is all for today, because technical capabilities do not allow us to continue any further. Dear colleagues, Yevgen Romanovich, please proceed. Thank you. I'll try to be constructive. First of all, I'd like to suggest one statement in connection with the fact that we're discussing racism and its emergence. This notion, I suggest that we institute the term anti-racism. Perhaps it already has been used, but it seems to me that anti-racism could unite not only Ukrainians but also representatives of other countries, and it could also serve as some kind of a international movement that would be directed against eliminating this phenomenon. As for the peculiar features of racism, Regrettably, they have not been mentioned, but I guess this is a matter of general understanding. Ruscism is a kind of fascism, or on the state level, because fascism can also be manifested as a political party or a political doctrine, but here it exists on the state level. Secondly, this is nuclear weaponized ideology. And finally, this is an ideology which uses energy as a weapon. These are the three characteristic features of this phenomenon. It also seems relevant to me to mention the topic of genocide in this regard, because racism as we know it today, as we see it today, not only as an ideology, for a long time it has used genocide against Ukrainians and Ukraine. It has been said today that a typical feature of racism is portraying itself, portraying its nation, its community as something that is supreme over others. That is exactly what is typical of racism. That is basically this axis, this pillar of the phenomenon at hand, which is having its practical manifestation in developments we are seeing in Ukraine. Let me express my gratefulness to you for the ability to participate in this event today, and also let me note and praise the role of the Center for Russian Studies in studying this phenomenon. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brashada. Mr. Oleg Romanchuk, please proceed, you have 3 minutes. Mr. Oleg, we cannot hear you. Could you please switch on your microphone? Now we can hear you, thanks. Good afternoon once again. Using this brief moment, I'd like to inform the participants of the Roundtable of my recent article on this topic, which was published in March this year, called Ruscism, the Cancer Tumor of Humankind. It has been republished on 8 websites and translated into English and French. It has been printed in the United States of America with a circulation of around 50,000 printed editions. I have just around 1.5 minutes, so let me just briefly mention a few aspects. We're discussing the origins of racism. We're not simply discussing the comparison between racism and Nazism and so on, which means that we need to take a deeper look inside history. A very riveting remark on this topic was given by Lev Gumilov, who characterized this super Russian ethnos. It emerged 500 years later than Western European ethnic groups, and that is the source of trouble, which means that there is no culture, there is no science, there is lack of logical thinking. As for the ideological thinking, Mr. Ohryzko has had many meetings with fellow diplomats during negotiations. We can also remember the brilliant designation of racism given by Johar Dudayev and by Lev Tolstoy. So in his writings we could see the treatment of Russians, and that is exactly the example for us to follow. One of my friends who served in Afghanistan, Soviet army and intelligence unit, he told me that the problem of Ukrainians was that we treat Russians as people, but in reality Russians only resemble what can be called human. There was a film at the turn of 1980s called Mr. Udacha Andreevich, starring Armen Jaharkhanyan, where he played a teacher of music. The film contains some very prominent characteristics of Russian culture, and it was also devoted to discussing what Russian people are and what are their origins, because we know that there were Tatars and Cheremis on Moldovs, which means that the Russian people are kind of a mix or a cocktail of all these ethnic groups. Lev Gumilov once again delivered a very apt remark in this regard. He delivered a very vivid account of ethnic anti-system, and this anti-system which Putin's Russia represents existed before. He also explained vividly what are the features of this system, and he also explained its aspiration to destroy and annihilate everything that it sees before it. The social Darwinism is really relevant here as a source of explanation for what this tumor is doing to the world, this tumor that has metastasized into ruscism in Ukraine. And once again, I'm also reminded of the writing of a world-renowned physiologist, Pavlov, who also, in his experiments over dogs, gave his characterization. Mr. Oleg, excuse me, we're pressed for time. I must admit that I have a very low opinion of Russians, because they cannot really comprehend reality as it is. For this Russian people, only words exist and not the idea that these words depict. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Oleg. And finally, Mr. Ostap Krivnik will be the one to finish our today's discussion. He is on the front line, which makes it all the more pleasant for us to hear what he has to say. Mr. Ostap. Thank you, Mr. Volodymyr. I'm not on the front line, but actually engaged on active military duty. I think that the issue of racism is a global one, which has global implications, because Russia actually possesses a nuclear capability, and it also has it also produces a huge amount of food, and has a huge stockpile of potable water, which is going to have its implications if the balance of power changes and Russia becomes a colony of China. There are many other leverages which Russia can use tactically. There are 4 brief observations I can make regarding racism as ideology. The first is that very important thing. This is the claim that Russia makes to turn racism into a world ideology, a source of global values. Communism tried to do the same, and actually these traditional values could be used to appeal to Africans, to Hindus. Well, if this is possible, a subject, it can be called into question, because Putin is the man who has had many wives, which is evident of the fact that he does not really adhere to these values he's trying to spew. Let me also mention the subtle difference between ruscism and Russian word, because I think that here Patriarch Kirill can be the one who will spell a death knell to this Russian ideology. All these things related to ethnic nationalism is what Russian world is trying to overcome. The third thing is related to the evolution of ruscism. I think that empires usually crumble, and after the empire crumbles, ruscism will be in for an ideology of sectarianism, which will eventually turn into terrorism. The fate of Ukraine will define the fate of Russia. The fate of Russia will define the fate of Eurasia. Ukrainians, it is out of our power actually to handle this question ourselves. So the fate of Russia is something that the whole world must consider, and we need to ask ourselves what is our part, what is our role in this process. Thank you once again, Mr. Volodymyr, and good health to you. Thank you, Mr. Ostap. You have actually drawn a line under our discussion, deciding all of its priorities. I thank you for serving on the front line, although you do not admit it, but still you are doing things that we cannot do, and your heroism is commendable. As usual, dear friends, we do not have enough time, but still I'd like to thank first of all our wonderful speakers for their absolutely unique and insightful presentations, which I think have brought us closer to understanding what ruscism actually is. This is just the first initial stage, which means that we are just at the beginning of our work, and I'd like representatives of the academia and representatives of the educational circles to take this initiative further, to bring it to discussions with their foreign colleagues from other institutions and universities. Perhaps they could involve our center in these discussions, because let me say it once again, we're just groping the subject. We need to give the exact characteristics of the phenomenon in question, because this is important in bringing Russia to account. This must be enshrined in international law somehow, and it can be done only after we give a draft resolution to the UN General Assembly on what ruscism actually is. Therefore, dear colleagues, I'd like you to consider today's discussion only as the beginning of this process. It cannot be endless, but I think that we have colossal potential to take it further. Seeing the distinguished gathering we have here, I am sure that we have enough prominent people to make it happen, let alone those who have not been able to join us due to certain circumstances. So my suggestion is simple: let's develop this work, let's make it as professional as possible, because this is going to be very helpful for our country to fight against this barbarian ideology, this misanthropic ideology that must be punished and prohibited. And lastly, let me thank our wonderful interpreters. I know that this profession is actually very difficult. Let me say sorry if we have been speaking vastly too fast. Let me also thank Director-General of GDIP, Mr. Paolo Krivonos, for the tremendous amount of assistance that he usually provides to us, and for the unique organizational capabilities that you offer. Hopefully we will continue this discussion in the future in this wonderful hall and technical capabilities that you offer. Thank you very much again.